Welcome back to the Chara Project. I'm Heather.
I'm Sarah.
Here at the Chara Project, we're all about helping you build confidence in studying the Bible. We do that through the Chara Bible Study Guide, which is an easy guide that teaches you the questions to ask when studying the Bible. It's going to walk you through the context, the history of the Bible, the different authors of the Bible, what researching words would look like in order to be able to apply the Bible to your life. And when we talk about studying the authors and the different authors of the Bible, we often camp around what literary styles or writing styles they use to communicate their message. And that's what we're going to focus on today. We want to be able to walk through, there's 9 different literary styles. So with each literary style is a different form, poetry, narrative, prophecy of how we're going to study the Bible and approach that writing style. And today we're focused on parables. Probably one of the more popular writing styles, I think. I feel like a lot of people get excited about studying parables. There's just something about a good story that I think entices people. And so I'm excited for us to walk through how to study parables today.
I love the parables, and I think this is one of my favorite literary styles to study. And I think when I hear of parables, I often think of Jesus, right? Yeah. And so we do find a lot of the parables there. But Jesus was a master storyteller. Yeah. The way he communicated with people in a masterful way to get them to hear it and consider new things. And anyways, parables is really one of those. And in parables, we find that there's stories and their illustrations that they communicate a spiritual truth. Yeah. Jesus told about 40 different parables that are spread throughout the Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But we also see some in other places too. We do see some parables even in the Old Testament. There's a parable, actually I love this one, in 2 Samuel, where the prophet Nathan comes and confronts David regarding his sin with Bathsheba. And so there's a parable there too. And so, yeah, they're spread throughout the Bible. But again, I think when I hear of parables, I typically think of Jesus.
Well, and if you're interested in knowing the different 40 parables that Jesus spoke to or are told, we actually have a list on our website that you can go and access that lists them all out, because we are such fans of the different stories that he did communicate. There's something unique about parables here, though. And so I just want to kind of talk about what are the 5 things that potentially help stand out parables that we should know about them that help us understand them a little bit more deeply. Number 1 is typically they were short. In fact, some were as concise as one verse. Matthew 13:44 is a great example of a treasure hidden in a field. It's 1 verse long. So if you're looking for a really short Bible study, no, just kidding. It's not bad.
Yeah.
And also a really good parable. But also they were simple stories that were speaking to a spiritual truth. Oftentimes Jesus is telling the story. There's a moral of the story kind of built into the story that you're supposed to walk away with. And that's because he's doing it in a way that's relatable, which is our 3rd thing we should know about parables. They were relatable to the people of that day. And so oftentimes they were connected to Jewish culture, and he's engaging his audience, Jesus is, to be able to help them relate in a way in that moment, in that time period, that would help them go, okay, I get it. And so the other piece of it is it's not just a beautiful story. The 4th thing about a parable is that it had an unexpected ending. There's often this shock or this twist at the end that was bold and it was unexpected, and it would cause people to take notice and kind of lean in a little bit. Well, that wasn't what we were expecting. And then the 5th thing about parables that we should be aware of is that it was, and this is probably the most important, it's an invitation for a decision. Every time that there was, whether it was Nathan or Jesus that was communicating, they're capturing the imagination of their audience in these stories, but they're encouraging them to ask questions and think about, to maybe take on a new perspective that they hadn't even thought of, to make a decision about how they're going to view a decision moving forward, whether it's around the kingdom of God or how they follow Jesus. There was a decision that needed to be made, and that was being invoked by the story being told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk about the 2 different types of parables that we see. We see both stories and illustrations. Let's talk about stories first. Stories are exactly that. I mean, they've got a plot, they've got characters, they have a beginning, and they have an end. And there's a lot of, I think, my favorites fall under this category. They're like the Good Samaritan, the Prodigal Son. These stories will reveal whoever Jesus was speaking to. It would help reveal their heart heart. He's telling the story for a reason, right? It would touch their conscience. And often, as you were mentioning, it would call for a response by considering their actions.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned the Good Samaritan that we find in Luke chapter 10. And you have this expert in the law asking Jesus, trying to justify his actions. Well, who is my neighbor? Who am I required to love? And through this story, and really kind of with this surprise ending here of, gosh, who really showed to be the neighbor here, it I think convicted the expert in the law on who he was required to love, what loving your neighbor looked like, and who was your neighbor.
Yeah.
So it really evoked it convicted and it evoked a response, or it should. And so a lot of the stories are like that, and I really love a lot of the parables that are story forms. But we also have these illustrations that we see, and these are taken from everyday life to make a point. These would challenge the mind by encourage you to consider a different perspective. They could provoke the imagination, and like the mustard seed. Maybe we've heard of this one, right? In Matthew 13. The parable of the mustard seed, it says, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of the seeds, but when grown, it's taller than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the sky come and nest in its branches. And the overall takeaway here is really that something seemingly insignificant is going to change everything. A lot of these illustrations might even begin with the kingdom of God is like this one did. And a lot of them will even be a call to urgency.
Yeah.
To pay attention to urgency that the kingdom of God is at hand. So there's a lot of those illustrations.
Well, and regardless of what type of parable you're reading, what you're finding is they're connected to this Jewish culture of the day.
Yeah.
They're made to be easily understandable to the people, to impact the original audience that was being told these stories. Oftentimes that might separate us a little bit because of 2,000 years of time between it, but it was definitely meant for that audience at that time. And it's these rich stories and illustrations that really were tugging at their emotions because it was tied to their culture, that it helped them really focus in on who Jesus was, or the kingdom of God, to the point where they were calls to action. And so you see they were helping Jesus. Jesus was really helping them not say, hey, go love your neighbor, but I'm going to teach you how to think, and I'm not going to tell you directly what to do. I'm going to do it through a story, which is so beautifully done.
And so much more impactful. I think that's a really great point. Had Jesus just said, go love your neighbor, and then, or tells this story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, it challenges you in a whole new way.
Completely.
And gets you it forces you to think of your own actions. And am I doing that well? Let's talk about really the purpose of parables. And we've kind of hinted at this already, but twofold, really to reveal the kingdom of God in some way, and of Jesus' ministry and in his teachings, but to understand and to respond to Jesus' ministry. And his teachings. And again, we do that by influencing and challenging the thinking of the original audience, getting you to consider a different perspective about Jesus and about his kingdom. And once again, we mentioned this, they were a call to action. They would invoke a response. They were meant to.
Well, yeah, and every single story, every single word that Jesus used, he was doing it as a way to convey what was really important to him, right? The kingdom of God was important to him. People understanding why he came and what his purpose was while he was on earth. Those were really important things. And so he's using it in a way to capture the attention of the listener so that he can convey what really was at the heart of what he cared about the most.
Yeah, they were especially effective both back then and today. And I think in a few situations, a few scenarios, and let's look at a few of them. When someone doesn't realize really how bad they've messed up, how bad they're in sin. And the example we kind of talked about already is the parable that Nathan told David following his adultery, his sin with Bathsheba. That highlighted to David. You read that parable in 2 Samuel, and then you see David realize his error, realize what he had done, in the gravity of his sin. So in that scenario, also when someone really is convinced that they're right, but they're not.
But they're not.
This is why we can use parables today too. I'm thinking of some family members and stuff, or maybe they need to, use this on me, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But particularly the Pharisees, we're actually going to get a great example of this coming up here soon. But Jesus told a lot of parables to Pharisees and all kinds of different audiences, but a lot of them were given to the Pharisees, who were religious leaders of that day, and he was trying to show them, hey, your actions are not in alignment with God's heart and God's desire. Also, when someone is justifying their actions, we saw that with really the parable of the Good Samaritan, and this expert in the law is trying to justify who he had decided what loving his neighbor looked like, who that was and what it looked like. And Jesus just, this parable, man, it just calls them out, calls them on the carpet and says, this is what really loving your neighbor looks like. So there's a couple of situations there. I think that there's powerful, parables are so powerful. But I do want to also communicate a word of caution that every detail in a parable does not have hidden meaning. We want to be careful. Parables are not allegories. Be careful, or I'm going to caution against turning every single detail into an entirely different meaning that the author never intended. So be just a word of caution there. Be careful about taking that too far.
Well, that's good, because as we're going to dive in now to how do we study parables, and that word of caution, I think, is something we can layer on top of, okay, that's what not to do. Here's what we should do. Okay. And I want to give 5 tips on what it would look like for us to actually study parables. The first is, I want you to read it. I want you to read it again. Make sure that you are grasping the insights and catching the details, familiarizing yourself. Maybe that means reading it in a different Bible translation. Make sure you get a chance to really understand what it's saying first. Number 2, then identify the original audience that was being communicated. As we understand, and we talk about this a lot at the Chara Project, when we understand the original audience, we understand a better perspective of how they would have heard the message. Typically, when you're looking at Jesus's parables in the Gospels, you're going to find that he's going to either be talking to his disciples, he's talking to the Pharisees, which were the religious leaders of that day, or he was talking to a large group of mixed people. Knowing that helps you place, oh, the Good Samaritan, he's talking to an actual scribe or a person of the law. Yeah. That's going to change maybe how his answer is received from the original hearer, but also for us as we interpret it. And that's always going to be the case. We're always going to want to identify the audience. That's kind of a go-to for the Chara Project. Number 3, we want to identify the characters, especially the story versions of parables. We want to identify the characters in the parable. Typically, there's about 1 to 3-ish that are highlighted in a story of some sort. Take note of how they're described. And what do you understand about their description? Who's described more? Is there somebody that's described in more length? Maybe there's a reason for that. Is there a purpose behind that? There likely is. That the story is going to be more important for you to lean in on that if there's a larger description about one person versus another. Yeah. Number 4, make sure you're looking at cultural references. Again, something else we talk a lot about, that history of a parable and understanding the reference points for the original audience would catch, especially for parables, because it's based in Jewish culture. We need to make sure we're placing ourselves there too. Study Bibles help with that a ton, and as well as commentaries to help give us some of the cultural pieces that we may miss along the way. And then number 5, make sure you're noticing the ending, right? We talked about this earlier. That twist in that ending, there's a reason for it. Look at how the story ends. It's unexpected. The listener's not anticipating it. And typically the moral of the story, or the thing that Jesus is really wanting you to lean in on, is in that ending. There's a reason why he twisted it, because he's trying to get the attention of the listener. And so just make sure that you're focused there. Mm-hmm. These parables had shock. There was a shock value that Jesus had, and almost a little bit like a good joke. The ending's not always what you expect it to be, and so it can become very impactful, but it's more impactful when you understand some of the reference points, you understand the audience that it's going after. When we're removed 2,000 years away from the culture, we may miss some of the nuances that come with parables, and so that's just something for you to keep in mind. A good study Bible commentary alongside of you will help a lot on that historical context.
Yeah, it does. Without knowing some of those reference points, we do lose some of that impact, much like a joke. If I have to explain a joke to someone, it loses some of its punch. Yeah. And so
that happens a lot with my husband and I. I'm like, what is that joke? Oh, I'm
You're
sorry.
Like, that's not very funny. He's like, well, it was
funny, Heather.
Yeah. Okay. So those tips are really, really helpful. And now let's go ahead and let's read a parable.
All right. I love it.
And let's apply those tips that Heather just read, those questions to it, and see how powerful they really are.
I love it. Where are we going?
We're going to go to Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. And it this is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And this is what it says. He also told this parable, again, Jesus, he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and looked down on everyone else. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee was standing and praying like this about himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like the other people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of everything I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but kept striking his chest and saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you, this one went down to his house justified rather than the other, because everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Okay, let's go ahead and look at some of those 5 things that you asked and apply them. Okay.
All right, let's
So
do
the
it.
first one was really about the characters. Does the parable have characters, and how were they described?
Well, the 2 characters that were listed was the Pharisee and the tax collector.
Yep.
The Pharisee was a little confident in his prayer life and a little braggy in how he was described. That's not a word, but Heather's making it as a word.
Oh, well, he was. And even like, I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of everything that I get. Like he was
like, puff my chest up.
what I have done. My actions have made me righteous.
Totally. And
Yeah.
then you have the tax collector, who I'm just picturing is just like head down. I
Yeah.
mean, he like it says that he can't even raise his head to the heavens, and he's so humble in his approach and almost just begging for mercy in the way that he approaches it. It's just totally, totally different from the Pharisee.
Yeah. Oh, he knows. He says, God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. Like he knows
it.
He knows he's a sinner.
Yeah.
Okay. So that leads right into this next question here. What are some of those cultural reference points that we might be missing that will help us understand this parable?
No, it's a great call out, especially if you don't know anything about a Pharisee or a tax collector. You'd be like, okay, who are these dudes and why do I care?
Yeah.
But if you understand that a Pharisee was a religious leader of that day, and not only that, but they were known for keeping the law. Like they were the ones that everybody looked to say, who do I emulate and who is my example of what living a holy life looks like? And then you have the Pharisee coming in and puffing up his chest and being all
Look how righteous I am.
a little too confident in his righteousness. And then on the flip side, the tax collector back then, tax collectors in the Jewish culture, they were people that had turned away from the Jewish people and had sided with Rome to go and collect taxes again. So they were outcasts. They were considered the lowest of the low to the Jewish people because they had turned against them and were on Rome's side instead of on the Jewish culture side. So they weren't highly regarded. Matthew, one of the disciples, was a tax collector, and I'm sure he was not one of the favorites of the disciples for that exact reason. They were not highly viewed.
They were looked at as sinners, right?
100%.
Betrayers. Yeah.
Betrayers is a great word. So then you see, now layer that on with the attitude that he had. And he's coming so humbly when you can tell he understands the heart of his sin and the heart of his posture. It's just coming out loud and clear. Makes us understand this parable a little bit more by understanding the history of the players.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we get to the ending. And the ending is unexpected. To the original audience, this would have been very unexpected ending. So what do we see here?
Well, yeah, because I think if you were listening and you were to predict how the story should have ended, we'd be like, oh yeah, of course, the one that is the holiest, the one that should be the example for us, this Pharisee, should be the guy that Jesus is saying is thumbs up, you're doing great.
The one who fasts, the one who tithes.
Yeah, he's checklisting all the right things, and that's not who Jesus calls out as the one that is worthy. It's instead the one that's justified as the tax collector.
Yep.
It's beautiful, beautiful twist, showing that it has more to do with the heart than it does to do with the actions.
Well, it does. And it ends with everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted.
So it's so good.
It is good. So yeah, a very unexpected ending, really, now that we know the cultural reference points, we get the joke. Well,
Right.
it's not a joke, but we get it, right? We get why this parable is so powerful. But there's one other thing we should be looking at here, and it's looking at who was the original audience. Who was Jesus telling this to? Because that helps us understand how they would have heard it.
Well, yeah, and I love it. They never actually say it's Pharisees, but let's be honest, they're kind of saying it's Pharisees because the first verse says, he told the parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and looked down on everyone else. Even if it's not Pharisees,
Yep.
even though the Pharisee did that in the story, but even if it's not Pharisees, he's telling the story to people that really needed to have a heart check on, you think you're too good. Be careful that you are trying to use your actions and your righteousness as like, I got this, I'm good, check mark. I love that it calls it out like that.
I do too. And I think this parable is just as meaningful for us today. If we are relying on our righteous acts and we're looking at those acts saying, I'm good, you know, but man, look at that guy over there, that sinner. And meanwhile, that sinner is acknowledging his sin. He's repenting before God. He's humbling himself before God. This is very, very applicable today. And we should be able to see this, to read this, and it should impact our lives.
I love that. I think that's a great point. This is probably why we love studying parables so much, at least here at the Chara Project, but also I think a lot of people do, is because there's a lot of truths that we can pull out that can be applying to our lives. Now, if we wanted to call out some tools of things that you can use to help your resources that you can use when studying parables, we've mentioned a few today. Number one, make sure you're reading the context, because oftentimes context is going to tell you the author. It might give you some historical context, or it will tell you not the author, but the audience. And so you're going to want to read the context. Make sure you use different Bible translations, because oftentimes that can give you a fresh perspective on maybe a parable you've heard many, many times before. And then that study Bible or commentary is going to give you some of that historical, cultural reference points that oftentimes we miss. I think those are kind of the basics, I think, tools that would be helpful.
Yeah. Every once in a while, you're going to find one parable told in more than one gospel. And so reading it,
fair.
in another gospel too might be helpful as well.
Now, if you're interested in studying parables and this is something that intrigues you a lot, like it has us, we actually have a Bible study on our website that you can access called the Parables Bible Study. It is a 13-week study. It walks through a bunch of different parables, teaches you not only how to study it, just like we did today, but it does walk you through each of the different fun, they're really fun parables. You will absolutely love it. So make sure you access the Parables Bible Study, as well as the parables list of the 40 different ones if you wanted to study them on your own. Now that you have the guide from us on how to do it, go to that list of 40 different parables from Jesus on our website. And make sure you tune in next time as we continue to study how to build confidence in studying the Bible. This is a great chance for you to be able to engage with us, so make sure you like, comment, subscribe. We want to hear from you, and we will see you next time as we continue building confidence. Thanks for joining us.